No Pear Deck needed today. For this session, I should say. All right, you're all set, Ken.
Except that I was muted. That's the only thing. Okay. Institutions. You know, I personally, over the last 10 years or so, have become convinced that when we're teaching economics and we want to talk about different economies, or is China capitalist or not? What's going on in Venezuela? That the language of capitalism, socialism, communism, whatever you want, leaves us short all the time, as Debbie was kind of saying. And that if we can begin to think more in terms of what institutions are present, and you're going to see that in the activity you do, it becomes a much more valuable discussion, I think. So we're going to take a little while here to talk about those institutions that we think matter when it comes to economic growth. And why aren't I moving again? There we go. So proposition is that a nation's institutions determine its ability to reduce poverty. Now, you could put in there, or promote economic growth. What do we mean by institutions? We've mentioned it earlier. Formal and informal rules of the game. They shape incentives. They outline expected and acceptable forms of behavior in social interaction. When we're working with high school students, I like to ask them, what are the institutions at your school? And can you separate the formal from the informal? So we get, well, you change classes when the bells ring. Is that formal or informal? And they come up with a lot of formal ones. You got to be there on time. You got to do your homework. But they don't get the informal until I say, where do you eat lunch? And generally we're working with juniors and seniors. And of course I say in the cafeteria, and I say, yeah, do you eat with the freshmen at your table? And all of a sudden they get it. That's an informal rule of the game. Nobody said, juniors and seniors, or seniors, you sit at this table, freshmen, you don't ever go eat lunch with the seniors, but everybody understands it. And so we do have a lot of informal rules that impact the choices we make and change the incentives that we have. We run into them all the time, different conventions with different kinds of people and interactions. And what you begin to understand when you really start thinking about the institutions, if you want to change incentives and therefore change people's behavior, the easiest way to do it is to change the rules of the game. And so when you step back and look at our political decision makers, when they want to change what you and I do, what do? We change the rules of the game. You still make individual choices. Nobody came and held a gun to your head or put your arm up behind your back and marched you off. They just changed the rules of the game, which changed your choices so that we all conformed to a different set of outcomes. So those rules of the game, extremely important. The ones that we think impact economic growth the most are open and competitive markets, property rights, the rule of law, and entrepreneurship and innovation. These are the ones that shape the incentives for choices about the use of our resources. All right. They change the incentives. So let's take a look at each one of those and cast it a little bit into this notion of economic growth and how do we get the poor to become less poor. And it's been pointed out, and we're going to go look at some data later, that these things really make up what we would call economic freedom. This is the framework of how free an economy is or is not. How does it treat property rights? How does it promote or discourage open markets? What's the role of the rule of law? And is there a place for entrepreneurship and innovation? Those are economic institutions that really determine the freedom of an economy. So let's look at private property rights first. I think that is the sort of baseline. What do we mean by private property rights? Well, we mean lots of things. Land and buildings. Do I have a deed? Things, cars, books, iPhones, etc. What makes it mine? What makes this iPhone my iPhone? In this case, probably 99.9% at this point is possession. I don't think I could go find the receipt for it that had my name on it. So if somebody wanted to come and say, hey, that's my phone, I'd say, no, that's mine. Prove it. Well, we'd prove it because I know the code to get into the phone and they don't, right? So it's possession that makes it mine. And in most cases with things, that's what the case is, that you've got them. One that we often don't think about is contract rights. That falls under property rights. And as an economy develops, it's extremely important. Hey, you didn't adhere to the agreement we made. Well, the agreement was in writing. It's a contract between the two of us, and the courts, I have a process in the courts to sue on the basis of your breach of contract. So it is, contract rights are a property right, and in a developed economy like ours, very, very important. Ideas, it turns out, are property, right? I just read a piece yesterday about some 30-year-old who dropped out of Brown and just sold his company for, what was it, $20 billion to Adobe, because of the idea that he had with some software that I clearly have no understanding of whatsoever. So he had an idea that turned out to be worth $20 billion. How does he protect that idea? Copyrights, contracts, okay? Your labor, we have a property right to your labor. Lots of dispute sometimes about just what I can sell myself, quote unquote, my labor for, and what I can't. We have some formal institutions that say what you can and can't do with your labor. And that changes the incentives of what choices people make of what they're going to do with their labor. Now, property rights, we take them for granted in the United States. I mean, the contract law is clear. Every inch of this country, it seems, is platted and filed with the city and county office. We were just having a little discussion about a road that runs behind us, and I started digging into it a little bit, and I found a plat map for where I live that dated 1903. Had my lot that I'm on platted clear back in 1903. So we've had property rights around for a long time and very well developed. Not the case in lots of places in the world. A book that was written several years ago called The Mystery of Capital by a person named Henry, right? DeSoto. In that book, his estimate at that time, and it's probably still pretty close to accurate, was that only 10% of the continent of Africa was formally owned. Only 10%. Well, what do you mean formally owned? I mean platted, recorded, I have a deed. So, well, if a person didn't have a deed or a plat map for it, who owned it? Well, the country owned it, pretty much. And we don't have to turn the clock back very far in the United States to the Louisiana Purchase, who owned all that land out west? The government owned all that land. Could people go use it, squat on it? Yep, they did, but they really had no claim to the property they were living on until we formalized those claims with plat maps and with deeds and recorded deeds, much of that through our land rush and things like the Oklahoma land rush. So we had a whole bunch of the US that was unowned, if you will, by other than the government. Much of the continent of Africa. What happens on the continent of Africa then? Exactly what happened in those areas of Louisiana Purchase. People simply went, carved out a dwelling of some sort, maybe began farming, maybe began hunting, but lived as though it was theirs until it was formally platted. Well, what does that do? Well, interestingly, DeSoto, with that same idea in mind, he took a look at a neighborhood in Peru, a neighborhood that it turns out was all on government property, but it had fully developed. It had streets, it even had addresses. People had built what you and I would probably call a shack or a lean-to, but at least a dwelling place, but they had no legal right to it. So the only way to keep that dwelling was to have somebody in it literally 24/7. Somebody was home, because if they left and someone else came, they could simply say, this is mine. Now, it seems we're finding a few of those things happening in the United States from time to time on the news. We hear about somebody moved into some vacant property and tried to just take it over. But we've got a court system, we've got a legal system that will take care of that. If there's no deed or to the property, there was nothing that that person could turn to. And so you kept somebody home. Think about the ramifications of that. Who do you leave home? Do you leave home the 5-year-old child? Well, no, that doesn't make any sense.
Grandma.
Yeah, grandma. And sometimes that's exactly what grandma's job was. I don't know who said that, but you're right. No, that's exactly right. And more than likely, you at the very least leave a teenager or more home, and probably a parent or a grandma. So if you want a little more bread on the table this week, how can you increase the income of the household? You send the child to work. You send the child to work because the child can't protect the house, but someone will pay the child to produce something. So you get an increase in child labor. Okay? DeSoto went in and convinced the government of Peru that if he had established, I like DeSoto because he didn't just write about this, he tried to do something about it. And he convinced the government of Peru to let him bear the cost of surveying and platting this neighborhood and then giving title to these people that lived there. Did that, and an amazing list of things as he checked back. I think it was just like 5 years later. Child incidents, child labor had gone down, literacy rates had gone up, incomes had gone up. All of those things had happened simply because that one institution was changed for those people in that neighborhood. Institutions can make a huge difference in what are the incentives and the behavior. We think child labor is terrible. For them, not as bad as the alternative. But as soon as that institution was changed and grandma could work or mama could work, then the kid could go to school. Child labor drops, literacy goes up, everything's better because we changed an institution. We didn't have to change the people, we just had to change the institution. So private property rights lies right at the bottom of a baseline foundation of economic growth. Rule of law. This is one we don't think about much. And I have to say, both as a student and then early on as a teacher of economics, I didn't talk enough about it. because it's incredibly important. What do we mean by rule of law? No one's above the law. Those that govern are subject to the same laws as those they govern. So in theory, at least, if President Biden gets in his truck and goes for a drive and runs a stop sign, he gets a ticket. That's what the rule of law says, that those who govern are subject to the same laws as those that they govern. That is not true around much of the world, and certainly not in underdeveloped countries. What do we find around much of the world? First, rule of force. Simply those with the biggest gun or the heaviest fist are the ones in charge. Across Africa, we hear repeatedly about large sections of territory that are taken over by gang rule. We even a few years ago, sent US troops in to deal with a gangster in a couple of the countries of Africa because of the havoc they were causing by pillaging the people and the villages, all right? Because it's the biggest gun gets to rule. So rule of force, and then the other is the rule of man. By the rule of man, we mean that a person, a king, a dictator, or maybe a small group, a communist party, whatever the case may be, makes the laws, has the ability to change the laws, not just interpret, but change the laws at their discretion and on any timeline they'd like. Right? And so that would be the rule of man. I would certainly put Venezuela under the rule of man. You certainly would put North Korea under the rule of man. Cuba, certainly it was the rule of man. Many would say it still is. Some others would say, no, it's moving toward rule of law. I would put the former Soviet Union under the rule of man because it was a very small group who really had the power over the laws. I would still put communist China under rule of man. Some would disagree with me, but that's where I'd put it. So why is this important? Because of that last bullet up there. Uncertainty about the future stalls investment and economic growth. A rule of man country, you and I live in one, we feel pretty confident about what lies in the future, particularly when it comes to the laws, the institutions under which we will operate. So questions about investing in yours or your children's education, questions about buying a bigger house or taking on a mortgage, you think about the future and you've got a pretty confident view of, yeah, there's some things out there like inflation and stuff, but nobody's going to come in and say, well, you can't own that house. I'm taking your property right. Nobody's going to come in and say, you need 20 more years of education before you can teach. They might suddenly decide you need 2 more. I don't know. But it's that notion of a sense of certainty about the future. You put the rule of force in place and you have no sense about tomorrow at all. Will I be able to hold on to my possessions? Why bother to get an education? 10 of my friends were massacred last week. What good would an education do me then? Right? And the same then with the rule of man. It's muted a bit, but not a lot from the rule of force. We've seen that in the recent history in Venezuela when rules can change, taxation can change overnight, who can run a shop, a retail shop, and who cannot can change overnight. So I'm not going to make big investments in my future because I have no assurance whatsoever that that investment is going to create a return. And so as soon as investment stalls, economic growth stalls. It's just a fact, and we can look at various times in history that we see that and we're seeing it to some degree right now because of the uncertainty about inflation, and businesses are holding back. They're holding back because they no longer know how to make the product they're making. No, they still know how to make it. They still have all of the right people in place. But what they don't know is the future. And they're suddenly a little bit more uncertain about the future. So they're holding back. In this case, it's because of inflation. When we're looking at institutions, it's because of how the country is governed and what kind of certainty or uncertainty that leads to. Open competitive markets, freedom to enter and leave markets, to buy and to sell. Okay. Can you easily get into the marketplace? All right. Now, we would have some people in the United States say, you know, it's getting real hard to get into some markets. You can't just decide to be a plumber anymore. You got to get a license to be a plumber or an electrician, or a teacher. You can't just say, I'm going to do that. There are barriers to entry literally in the marketplace. In some countries, those barriers are very steep, even in terms of what one can sell to the public. So a freedom to enter and leave the markets. Private property rights, they're necessary for markets to function. If you're trying to sell me an iPhone, but I think somebody might come say, I'm going to take it away, you can't prove it's yours, I'm going to be much less likely to want to buy it. So the private property rights extend right into the marketplace in terms of it functioning. What we find, I'll show you a little graph here, I can't remember if it's the next slide or the one after, that open markets, that is easy to get into the market, lots of buyers and sellers, means there's going to be more sellers, and that means lower prices. Okay. The other piece, the last institution, is entrepreneurship and innovation. The entrepreneur, economic growth is significantly impacted, and you could almost say dependent upon the entrepreneur. The undertaker, entrepreneur comes from a French word, and the undertaker, not in the sense of the mortician, but the undertaker in the sense of the one who's going to undertake the endeavor, the enterprise, bring together the labor and the capital and the ingenuity to produce a product, the one who brings it all together. That's the entrepreneur. And we need those entrepreneurs out there taking new ideas and putting them into production, because what in the end does that usually do? It usually increases our productivity. And we've already seen that increased productivity means increased economic growth, means less poverty. The other piece that encourages is innovation. Innovation we like to separate from invention. Invention is a little bit more of a sort of scientific fact. Innovation is, what can you do with that? How can you turn this new discovery into a product that increases productivity, life expectancy, health standards, etc. So the innovation really includes bringing it to the marketplace, if you will. Innovation means there's going to be higher productivity, means there's going to be more supply, there's going to be lower prices. Now, I couldn't go the day without putting in one supply and demand graph, right? We've got supply, we've got an increase in supply brought about by both open markets, that is, more people entering the marketplace, moving from S1 to S2, by innovation and entrepreneurs, moving the supply from S1 to S2. And what does that do? Even if the demand stays constant, that red line, look what happens to prices. Prices fall. Prices go down, and suddenly everybody, including your 10-year-old son or daughter, is carrying an iPhone, because the prices have come down from where they were at first. The prices of electric cars are coming down, where it might be a reality that nearly everyone has one. Right? So And those prices come down when you allow for open markets and you allow for innovation. Now, when that happens, who benefits from those lower prices? The poor. Bill Gates had an iPhone. Jeff Bezos has an electric car. He'll have an electric car no matter what the price. Bill Gates will have a phone no matter what the price. But the poor, it makes a huge difference when those prices fall of what they can have. Continent of Africa, almost fully connected by cell phone. Decades and decades, if not infinity, ahead of if you tried to connect the continent of Africa with landlines of telephone. And you know what that does for them? At a moment in time, it makes them as rich as Bill Gates. Because when Bill Gates gets a toothache, what's he do? He picks up the phone and he calls the dentist and he makes an appointment. And he goes and he gets it taken care of. If you were in Africa in a small village outside of a city, what do? You ride a bus or walk to the city to go see if you can see the dentist. And if the dentist is on vacation or the dentist is too busy to see you, you suffer for a day or more days with the toothache. Maybe you were able to make an appointment and you come back. What do you do now? You pick up your own cell phone, or you go and pay a fee to use a community cell phone, which is the case in some places, and you call the dentist and you make an appointment. So you don't waste a trip to town. You don't suffer and get all the way into town and find you can't see the dentist. And at that moment that you pick up the phone and make an appointment, you're every bit as rich as Bill Gates. He can't do any more than you can do at that point. And that's because of innovation and open markets, which cause better and more products at falling prices. It is the poor that economic growth is the greatest beneficiary to, are those at the bottom of the spectrum, not those at the top of the spectrum. So those institutions are incredibly important. And when you want to talk about economic growth, look to the institutions. And to say economic development, we really should be saying institutional development. Do they have those things in place so that economic growth can occur? And when we look back at that data, where we show from 1980 to 81 that there are less and less extremely poor, that correlates very well with the development of the institutions in places like sub-Saharan Africa, in places even like China, where much of that gain in economic growth and fewer extremely poor has come. You can point to the change in the institutions. So if you want to help people get better off, help the institutions get better developed. All right, Debbie, it's yours, unless there's questions.
Okay, thank you, Ken. So Ken, there were lots of good questions that were coming up in the chat while you were teaching. While I'm doing the activity, maybe you could read through those and we could address some of those during the Q&A time.
Okay, you need me to unshare, right?
I have the power to take
Look at that, I beat you to it.
Awesome. All right. So let me share over here. My husband just got back. I what do you call that? Delegated shopping for the 8-year-old's birthday gift today and sent him to Hobby Lobby to get craft, supplies for her. So he had a budget, but he didn't do very well. But he got lots of fun craft supplies. All right. Okay, so here's our next activity. We're going to do a little activity to look. Your job is going to be to look for those institutions in different countries. we're going to look for the presence or the absence of those institutions. And so back to my my point about capitalism, I think when I ask students, what they think about capitalism, often they have this image of, like big corporations in bed with big business, big government, using power to get things that you want. And it's kind of, that crony capitalism, that exact opposite kind of thing that we were just talking about: open, competitive markets, rule of law, not the opposite of what we think of when we're talking about these institutions of economic freedom. So we're going to be putting you into breakout rooms, and in those breakout rooms, you're going to be assigned 4 different countries. And you're going to use the resource, the World Fact Book. It's something that the CIA puts together for all the countries of the world. Maybe you've used it before in geography classes or different classes. And you're going to go to the CIA World Fact Book for each of those countries, and you're going to look for, evidence of the presence of those institutions of economic freedom. So do you see the evidence of entrepreneurship and innovation? Do you see evidence of open and competitive markets? Do you see evidence of the rule of law, for example? So you're going to be partnered with, it might just be you, depending on, the number of people in your group, or you might be partnered with a person, and together you'll take a country and you'll go and look for evidence of those institutions. So research your assigned countries in the World Fact Book and look for evidence of the institutions of economic freedom. And then together, you're all going to come together and rank your countries from more economic freedom to less economic freedom. So the more present that those institutions are, then they would have more economic freedom. And the more absent that those institutions are, we would say they have less economic freedom. That'll be our next set of institutions. So the first thing I'm going to do is give you your slides that you're going to work together on. So let me put them here in the chat for everybody. So in the Zoom chat, go ahead and open up these team slides. They look like this. Oh, wow, you guys are fast. As soon as you click on them, they're going to pop you. Everybody's going to get plopped onto slide 1. But don't get too excited, because you're not all going to be in team 1. Once I send you into your breakout room, that's going to tell you what slide you're going to work on. So if you get assigned to team 1, you'll go to slide 1. But if you get assigned to breakout room number 2, you're going to jump to slide 2. Here's team 3, team 4. You can see each team has different countries. So I'm on slide 8 right now. Slide 8 is for team 8. They have the Czech Republic, Ecuador, Rwanda, and Sudan. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. While you're in your breakout rooms, if you have any questions, you'll just raise your hand. And I'm actually thinking right now, if that was, like Sudan, if I think is separated into South Sudan right now, if you could choose. I'm not sure if the CIA World Fact Book separates that yet.
Are you assigned us to breakout rooms automatically?
I am. Yeah. Okay, so, and you'll find out once we break out. So, and if you have questions while you're there, use the raise your hand feature and I'll pop in and answer any questions. And we'll give you, I wanted to show you the CIA World Fact Book before I send you away. So here's an example of the CIA World Fact Book. When you go to countries, you can just go alphabetically. I'll choose Canada, because I don't think I put Canada in anybody's country. And for Canada, you'll notice there are different sections for each country. The government might be a section you would want to look at. Economy has a lot of information usually that will be very helpful to you. Military and security, terrorism might be useful. You won't have time to go through all the information that's there. So I would recommend kind of jumping straight to the economy, looking at that, then maybe looking at government and some of these other categories as you have time, as you're looking for those institutions of capitalism. Here's the team slides. They kind of reinforce. They also give you the link to the fact book. And they reinforce your instructions. They remind you to research, once you're in your team, decide who's going to do which of these countries. They list out those 4 institutions that you're going to be looking for: open competitive markets, property rights, rule of law, and entrepreneurship and innovation. And then together, after you've had a time to kind of research those, come together as a team and rank them from the most free to the least free when it comes to economic freedom and the presence or absence of those institutions. All right. Okay, here we go into breakout rooms. Well, let me find them now. They are in a different place now that I'm sharing my screen. All right, on your marks, get set, go. Oh, I gotta reassign some people real quick. I'm gonna assign you here. We're gonna assign you here. And one more here. Okay, I think everybody's back. So let's start with team 9 and team 1. Both of you had the same country. So team 9, which of your countries did you see these institutions most present? Did you say Belgium, Brazil, New Zealand, or Niger? We'll start with team 9. That was, I just closed my list of rooms. Let me see if I can get it back. There we go. So anybody in team 9 can answer. This would be Deandra, Harry, Kirsten, Londra, Sarah, or Tabitha. Who did
We
you
said
guys?
Niger.
You said Niger most?
Yeah.
And who did you say for least?
I think we had Belgium.
Belgium. Okay. And team 1, you also had these countries. Who did you put for most?
We had most economically free New Zealand and
Okay.
least Niger.
Least Niger. Okay. And why? So Niger was different for you guys. Why Niger?
I'm sorry. I think I
Oh.
flip-flopped those.
Okay.
So just flip-flop them. Yeah.
Oh, so both of you placed Niger least.
talking
What
to
were
somebody?
some reasons
Yes.
why you guys both placed Niger least?
We just looked at the Fraser Institute data and comparatively their legal system, property rights, their how sound their money is, international trade and freedom to trade, and
Okay,
regulation.
let me ask first, William, let me ask the other group then. Anything on the World Fact Book that stood out as kind of evidence on the World Fact Book of absence of those institutions? Anybody from group 9? Nobody? Or William, without jumping to Fraser, did you guys find anything in the World Fact Book that would
Sorry
be
about that.
kind of alarming? Oh, go ahead, Harry.
Sorry, I was muted there. I was
Yeah.
running my yapper. I was muted up.
Oh,
No, we looked at that. We found there's a high debt in Niger. They had low GDP, low economic diversity with the different sectors. It was very agricultural, not as much industrial and service based.
okay,
So we thought just economic factors like that
okay,
would indicate, a lower level.
okay. Maybe not as much trade, especially internationally, if they're much more agricultural based.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
their biggest import was like rice. It was still foodstuffs, even though their economy was based on subsistence agriculture. I found that interesting.
Yeah,
We found
that right there is evidence of not a lot of entrepreneurship and innovation. Okay. How about, let's go to team 10. And I also, oh, you guys looks like maybe took some notes here. Team 10 and team 2 also had the same ones. So how did you rank? Is this your ranking with Ireland being, would this imply that Ireland is the most, had the strongest evidence of these institutions, and Iraq would be the lowest? Anybody from
Yes.
this?
Yes.
And what was some evidence from the fact book, if you want to speak to these? I can see you, somebody else, even though they're here, rather than me reading them.
Well, one of the
Well, I
biggest,
had Colombia, and the reason I chose it in the middle, especially about open competitive markets, in the CIA fact book, I noticed that in local elections, they tend to vote against any opening to foreign investment. So that is against open competitive markets. Also, I noticed that most of they're still on major commodities. So there's very little technological base. So that tells you that they're not into much entrepreneurship innovation.
Okay, great job. Any others? Want to speak about any of the other countries on this list from team 10?
I will.
Okay.
So when I was looking through the sheets and we realized somebody else was already putting in on the last slide, 12.
Yeah, we'll get there. Don't worry about that.
Well, anyways, 2 and 10, we came up with the exact same results. And
Really?
when we were putting up, yeah, because I'm like, hey, wait a minute, who put mine up there? I haven't done that yet. And so it was nice to see that we were on the same page, and I guess we were all using the CIA World Factbook one.
Good. That's awesome. And yeah, so let's go to number 2, team 2. Look, so you ranked in the same order. Any other evidence that you noticed, team 2, that from the fact book that helped you come up with that ranking? Team 2 was Alexis, Bill, DeFries, Svetlana, Catherine, Kevin, Theodore.
Yeah. For Ireland, they had a 89,000 GDP. Inflation was often below a point. Unemployment rate a very manageable 5%. However, I think from an Irish view, they recently had to get a pretty large bailout from EU and IMF, and have a fairly high percentage deficit as a percentage of GDP. But again, compared to the other countries, they're very, very strong.
Okay. All right. Good job. Good job. And let's go to team 3. This is Denmark, Hungary, India, Venezuela. Team 3 had Karen, Kirsten, Maxine, Onisha, Peter, Sharon, Tamika. Tell us your ranking.
It was a tie with Hungary and Denmark, I think, up top. And then last place was Venezuela. With all the economic problems, Venezuela was like under like extreme state control, and like basic goods were distributed through the military or like local political organizations, and it was very hard to. I mean, Hungary and Denmark were like in a economic death match for first place, because they were both just they had a lot of strong indicators all around. It was very hard to definitively place one over the other. So that's kind of where. I mean, if the ladies involved could probably push themselves if they really wanted to declare a winner, but it was kind of easy to come up with.
But a little bit harder, it sounds like, for you guys to delineate between those top 3.
The third was third was clearly India. But
okay.
Yes, but it was
Denmark and
but
Hungary,
1 and 2, yeah, they were hard.
So and team 11 had the same one. So team 11, what would you like to say about those? This is Christian, Elizabeth, Jasha, Jan, Jared, and Jennifer, the team of J's.
We ranked them the same way, but we felt that Denmark was clearly more advanced than Hungary. Denmark is much more diversified with its industry, world leader pharmaceuticals, maritime trade, had a lot more going for it than what was happening with Hungary. Hungary coming out of the communist era, it's had a little bit more difficulties with economic freedoms. One of the things that Hungary just recently did was privatize all the pension funds, so that knocked all the financial advisors out of work. So we thought that Denmark was number one, Hungary 2, India 3, and Venezuela, with all the human rights abuses and political corruption going on. They can't even get dollars distributed out to the economy. So there's arbitrage, there's corruption, there's big black market activity going on in Venezuela.
Okay. And we'll pick just a couple other of these here. Let's look at team 6. They had Greece, Peru, Vietnam, and Uganda. What about you guys? Oh, and I give a gold star to team 6. The way they organized, I pop in and I could see people talking to each other, but everything was silent. So from what I gather, they had kind of divided off into pairs about who was going to do what. And then maybe you guys exchanged phone numbers. So they were talking to each other, but everybody was on mute. And then they had decided a time they would all come together and talk. So it sounded like, or visually looked like what was happening was very productive. So team 6 is Deborah, Heather, Jacqueline, Kelsey, Noel, Orwan, and Paul. What did you guys come up with for Greece, Peru, Vietnam, and Uganda?
Reorganized in that list that you see right there, in that order: Greece, Peru, Vietnam, Uganda, in that order.
Oh, okay.
As most free being Greece and least free being Uganda.
And what were some of the evidence that you came up with in the fact book that maybe helped you, things you saw that either pointed to rule of law or open competitive markets or entrepreneurship and innovation? Or
I was just waiting to see if anyone else in my group was going to talk.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the one I specifically had was Greece, and we did break up into like pairs and then came back together. Then when we discussed in our ranking, a lot of it was if institutions were present, if government rule of law was present, like Uganda, for example, has a lot of corruption. Vietnam has communism, but the institutions are there. And so that has kind of helped support them a little bit more in trying to break into having a better economic system running. Peru too is like on its way, doing things, still some higher unemployment than you might like to see. And then Greece, they're a member of the EU, but they have a lot of financial debt. And so, the institutions are there, but we still end up ranking them of our 4 higher because the institutions are there. They just have such high debt to their GDP. And then things like obviously Corona, tourism, etc., hasn't helped them, but they have government support in place for people who might not have jobs or opportunity right now.
Okay. All right. So you can see this could be a much more involved activity with your students if you let them, do as a multi-day activity where they could have time to research and then come back the second day. This could be done with sticky notes on a number line on the chalkboard. The second part of this activity that I'm going to have you do is we're going to visit. Let me come back over here. I'm going to have you look up your country that you were assigned specifically, like you and a partner. You're going to go to that. We're going to go to the freetheworld.org, the economic freedom of the world. So even if you just Google free the world index.
Hey.
Is that a question? Or maybe I need to do economic freedom of the world. There we go. Economic freedom of the world index brings you to the map of the Fraser Institute. Some of you are already well aware of this resource, but what you're going to do is you're going to look up your country like Greece, type it in, and you can find their score. They're ranked 85, but they get a score of 6.81. So you're going to look them up, and then you're going to come back on the team slides. You're going to go to the slide at the very end, and you're going to put them at 6.81 on this slide, but you're going to do it in a color font that represents where you place them. So if they were top ranked in your group, you're going to use blue text. If you rank them second in your group, use green. If they were third, use orange. If they were last, use red. And then just place them on this number line. Okay, so you can do this without your groups. I won't send you back into groups. You can kind of just in the chat or even out loud, talk to each other. Who's going to do this? Look on I'll put the Free the World.
On the 1 to 10 scale, is 1 the most free or is 10 the most free?
10 would be the most free. Here's the link in the chat if you want to jump right to the map. And the reason 2020 is the most, there's always a lag in the numbers. So, excuse me. So this year in September is usually when they release the new numbers. And in September, they'll put out the 2021 report, which will use the 2020 data. So there's always a lag of like 2 years. So in 2022, we get to see the 2020, data. But you can see in color wise, the teal would represent the quartile, the most free countries. Green would represent, let me just kind of scroll down and show you, would be the next most free, then orange, and then the least most free countries would be red. And so this is an activity as you're putting your countries and kind of spreading them out on there. This could be done on a chalkboard, make a number line. They could use sticky notes. They could put them up on there. And what you're doing with this part of the activity is you're showing them that they just use what they know about the economic institutions that we just learned about and their informal research of the World Fact Book. And now we're comparing it with economics as a social science and what economic, social scientists and the research that they've done and how it compares to what they've done. A trend you're already noticing is that a lot of the blue, the top ranks that you guys placed correspond with the economic freedom rankings that are also top ranked countries according to the Fraser Institute and their economic freedom rankings. It's not just a solo project by the Fraser Institute. They work with institutes all around the country that contribute and pull the numbers and the data to, more scientifically, score these things. But let me give you I think I have this up here so I can actually read their definition of economic freedom. It measures the degree to which the policies and institutions of countries are supportive of economic freedom. The cornerstones of economic freedom are personal choice, voluntary exchange, freedom to enter markets and compete, security of person, and privately owned property. Sounds very familiar to the institutions that we've been talking about today. So this is kind of a good bookend to that activity that we just did and the institutions that Ken was talking about. So another activity related to institutions that you could run with your students, and one of my favorites is called the ultimatum game. And so there's also a link to this in the slides. This is an activity where your students participate. You just need something to give away. Points work well, bonus points, something that can be evenly divided, like 10 points. And the students are split in half, and half of them are asked to leave the room. And the other half that are there are given 10 bonus points, for example. And the only condition is that they have to split those points anonymously with one of the students that are outside of the classroom. And they will never know who they're splitting those points with. It's just anonymous. And so they get a piece of paper, an anonymous code, and the instructions, you can see you use envelopes and codes and a little paper. and they fill out, their how they want to split the points. And then they leave the room and the other kids come in and they get that form. There's no names on them. There's just codes that identify the students and, sticky notes that they use, and they decide whether to accept or reject. And if they accept it, they both get the points as proposed. And if they reject it, both parties get 0. And then the students start contemplating that question of why would anybody reject, even if they're given 1 point, why would anybody reject that? It's better than 0. Yet frequently students will reject low offers. If they're given anything less than 5, they might reject it. And so it brings up this idea of things like fairness and these informal rules of the game that Ken mentioned, these social norms that, even in capitalist systems where we would expect people to be more selfish, we end up with these outcomes where the outcomes, the splits end up being very equitable, and most people end up offering kind of 5 5s, and most of them end up being accepted. And it's kind of contrary to what we would expect. So it's a kind of an involved activity, as far as the activity itself doesn't take very long, but there's a lot involved in your role in setting it up and debriefing it when we're talking about kind of what's what's involved as far as the internalized norms that are involved because of capitalism. The theory is that some of these norms that we're introduced to because we interact so frequently in markets and anonymous transactions that we're just used to treating people fairly, and that is somehow reflected in the way that we treat people in this anonymous game where we could just treat people unfairly, but we don't. And so anyways, if you're interested in that game, all of the instructions are here. There again, it's a video that you could play and watch to help you learn how to set up the game. This one's a little bit longer. It's like a 15-minute video, but if you're interested in running that with your students, that is there as well.
Debbie, I've done this game before. I've noticed that the students who don't need the points are more likely to give away more points. And the students who really could use the extra bonus points are less likely to go 50. They're more likely to keep 8 and give 2. While the students who don't need the points are more likely to keep 2 and give away the points because it doesn't matter to them. So another aspect of human nature there.
Yeah, interesting. Yep. And you will still see rejections of those lowball offers, as people reinforce those standards of, hey, we treat people fairly around here, what's okay and what's not okay. All right. So it's definitely a fun one of my favorites. We're going to take a little break and then we'll come back and Ken will bring it all together. So why don't we take a 10-minute break? Let's